Donald Trump keeps raising the pressure on India. The message from America is clear. Accept our demands or lose access to our market. But India never panics nor rushes to apologize. It stands firm and answers on its own terms. And while Washington was trying to pressure India through trade, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar was in New York launching India's campaign for a seat on the United Nations Security Council for 2028 to 29. America may still have the power to impose tariffs, but it no longer has the power to dictate India's choices. This is not the India of 20 years ago. This is an India that acts according to its own interests. And every time Donald Trump raises the pressure, India sends back the same message. We will negotiate with you, we will work with you, but we will not be intimidated by you. Stay with us. Because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why India holds every card in this game. On July 13, India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar had stood at the United Nations and formally declared India's candidature for the UN Security Council's 2028 to 29 term. Early support came from the United States, Fiji, Austria, and Sri Lanka, followed by a growing number of countries across Africa and the Caribbean. The same country threatening India with economic penalties is the same country supporting India's bid for the world's most powerful security body. That contradiction is the story of what India has become. A country so significant to the global order that even the nation trying to pressure it cannot afford to treat it as an adversary. Too important to sanction fully, too powerful to control, too connected to the world's most critical supply chains, security architectures, and development partnerships to isolate. This is India in 2026. Not reactive, not apologetic, not recalibrating its foreign policy because someone in the White House posted something on social media. Here is what Trump did and what India actually did. The tariff story between the United States and India is a story about leverage. As the midterm elections get closer, President Trump needs to convince American voters that he has the leverage and that his trade strategy is delivering results. The problem is that India has refused to react the way Washington expected. India has not backed down at all. Instead, it has shown that it has more options than Washington expected. India could withstand Trump's higher tariffs without changing its policies because it does not depend too heavily on any one country for trade. Even if one country restricts Indian products from entering its market, it might hurt India, but it would not create a major economic crisis. The United States is India's largest single export destination. American consumers buy Indian pharmaceuticals, textiles, software services, gems, and engineering goods in enormous quantities. The Indian IT services industry is particularly exposed to the American market. These companies generate hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, a significant proportion of which comes from American clients. Any severe disruption to India-US trade would affect this industry and, through it, the broader Indian economy. But India has been methodically building alternatives. The bilateral trade agreements it has signed in recent years with the UAE, Australia, and several other economies with negotiations advanced with the UK and the European Union, are not primarily defensive measures against American tariff pressure. They are proactive expansions of market access that reduce the economic significance of any single bilateral relationship. When India negotiated a free trade agreement with the UAE, it opened a market of hundreds of billions of dollars that had previously faced tariff barriers. When it concluded a trade agreement with Australia, it gained preferential access to a high-income market in the Indo-Pacific. India follows the same strategy in its energy policy. It does not depend on just one country for oil or gas. It buys oil from Russia, the Gulf countries, Africa, and the Americas. It is also rapidly expanding renewable energy, building emergency oil reserves, and signing long-term gas agreements with different suppliers. Because of this, no single country can easily create an energy crisis in India by cutting supplies or increasing prices. The issue of Russian oil shows this clearly. Trump argued that India should stop buying Russian oil because the money could help Russia continue its war in Ukraine. India's response was that it buys oil based on price, availability, and the needs of its economy. India is not directly involved in the war, so it does not believe another country should decide where it can buy its energy. This is not simply India being stubborn. It is part of a foreign policy approach India has followed since independence. Earlier, this was called non-alignment, meaning India did not permanently join either the American or Soviet bloc. Today, it is often described as multi-alignment. This means India tries to maintain good relations with several major powers at the same time, without becoming fully dependent on any one of them. During the Cold War, India bought weapons from the Soviet Union while also maintaining economic relations with Western countries. In the same way, India can buy Russian oil today, while also building stronger defense, technology, and business ties with the United States. The main goal is to keep the freedom to make decisions based on India's own interests. Here are words that change the entire conversation. The strongest defense of India's Russian oil policy came from two of India's most confident and articulate voices on the global stage. Union Petroleum and Natural Gas Minister Hardeep Singh Puri consistently explained the economic logic behind India's decisions, while External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar defended the broader strategic principle. Together, they represented a significant change in the way India spoke to the world. Instead of sounding defensive whenever questioned about Russia, India increasingly spoke with the confidence of a country making sovereign decisions based on its own interests. In the early months of the conflict, Indian officials repeatedly acknowledged Western concerns, emphasized India's support for peace and dialogue, and carefully explained that buying discounted Russian crude was an economic necessity for a developing country. Those explanations were entirely accurate. Discounted oil saved India billions of dollars in import costs, reduced pressure on inflation, kept fuel prices lower for consumers, and improved the competitiveness of Indian manufacturing. But over time, something changed. The explanations remained the same, yet the tone changed completely. India stopped sounding like a country asking to be understood and started sounding like a country that simply expected its decisions to be respected. One of the first moments that demonstrated this shift came in Washington in April 2022. When Jaishankar was questioned about India's purchase of Russian oil, he did not begin by defending India's actions. Instead, he calmly pointed out that India's total purchases of Russian oil for an entire month were probably less than what Europe was buying in an afternoon. In a single sentence, he exposed the inconsistency in the criticism. Countries importing far larger quantities of Russian energy were questioning a country whose purchases were comparatively tiny. Rather than answering the accusation directly, he questioned the premise behind the accusation itself. As energy prices continued to surge throughout 2022, Jaishankar made India's priorities even clearer. He reminded international audiences that India was still a country with a per capita income of roughly $2,000, and that the first duty of any elected Indian government was to protect its own citizens from an energy shock. He famously remarked that the price of oil is breaking our back, and went even further by describing securing the cheapest available energy as my moral duty. The message was unmistakable. India's responsibility was first and foremost towards the economic well-being of 1.4 billion Indians, not towards satisfying the foreign policy preferences of richer countries that could absorb much higher energy costs. As criticism from Europe continued, Jaishankar broadened the argument beyond oil itself. He argued that Europe had to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. It was one of his most widely quoted remarks because it challenged a much deeper assumption in international politics, that Western priorities automatically become global priorities. India was making the case that every country has legitimate security concerns, economic compulsions, and national interests, and that no region should expect the rest of the world to bear disproportionate costs for problems that primarily affected it. The debate soon shifted from energy to geopolitics. Critics increasingly argued that India should choose between Russia and the West. Jaishankar rejected the idea entirely. Speaking at the Munich Security Conference, he remarked, "If I am smart enough to have multiple options, you should be admiring me." That sentence perfectly captured India's modern foreign policy. New Delhi saw no contradiction in purchasing Russian oil while simultaneously expanding defense cooperation with the United States, increasing trade with Europe, strengthening partnerships with Japan and Australia, and deepening strategic ties across the Gulf. In India's view, maintaining multiple relationships was not indecision. It was strategic independence. While Jaishankar defended India's diplomatic position, Hardeep Singh Puri focused on explaining why India's oil purchases also made economic sense for the wider world. Puri argued repeatedly that India's continued purchase of Russian crude had actually helped stabilize global energy markets during a period of extraordinary volatility. Had millions of barrels of Russian oil suddenly disappeared from international markets, he argued, prices could have risen dramatically, hurting both developed and developing economies alike. By continuing to purchase, refine, and export petroleum products, India had become an important stabilizing force in the global energy system rather than a source of instability. That argument exposed another irony in the criticism directed at India. The Russian crude that many Western governments criticized India for purchasing was being refined in Indian refineries and then exported as petrol, diesel, and aviation fuel to countries around the world, including many of America's closest allies. Indian refineries had become one of the world's largest suppliers of refined petroleum products, making them an indispensable part of global energy supply chains. Punishing India too aggressively therefore carried its own risks. It threatened to disrupt supplies of refined fuels that many of the same countries depended upon. Jaishankar highlighted this contradiction in his own characteristically direct style. When questioned about Western countries purchasing refined products produced from Russian crude in India, his response was simply, "If you don't like it, don't buy it." The remark was striking precisely because of its simplicity. No country was being forced to import Indian fuel. If governments believed those products were morally unacceptable, they were entirely free to purchase them elsewhere. The fact that they continued buying them suggested that commercial realities often outweighed political rhetoric. Perhaps the clearest summary of India's position came in 2026. Asked why India continued buying Russian oil despite growing American pressure, Jaishankar reduced the entire debate to one sentence: "I buy oil based on cost and availability." There was no apology, no elaborate justification, and no attempt to seek anyone's approval. In 8 words, he explained that India's energy decisions would be guided by only 2 considerations: whether supplies were available and whether they made economic sense for India. Everything else came afterwards. Taken together, the statements of Jaishankar and Puri reflected a profound evolution in India's foreign policy. India was no longer presenting itself as a country that needed to justify every strategic or economic decision to larger powers. It was presenting itself as a sovereign nation willing to cooperate with every major power, but unwilling to subordinate its own national interests to the geopolitical preferences of any one of them. Russia, America, Europe, or anyone else, India would work with all of them where its interests aligned and disagree with them where they did not. That, more than the debate over Russian oil itself, was the real message the world was hearing. Here's how India took center stage recently. On July 13, 2026, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar stood at the United Nations headquarters in New York and officially launched India's campaign for a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council for the 2028-29 term. The campaign was named Shanti, short for Securing Holistic Advancement Through Norms, Trust, and Integrity. It was also a clever choice of name because Shanti means peace in Sanskrit, perfectly matching India's message to the international community. The timing was significant. At the same moment that India was dealing with trade tensions and tariff disputes with the United States, it was also asking the world to support its return to one of the most important decision-making bodies in global politics. The message was subtle but powerful. India's global influence was not dependent on any single bilateral relationship. It intended to build its place in international institutions on its own strengths and through the support of the wider international community. Jaishankar began by describing what he called a paradox of the modern world. Humanity, he said, had never possessed greater scientific, technological, and economic capabilities to improve people's lives. Yet at the same time, the world was witnessing unprecedented levels of conflict, instability, and violence, affecting even countries far removed from the battlefields. In such a world, he argued, The United Nations Security Council could not afford to remain passive. It needed members that were prepared to take responsibility and help shape solutions. India believed it was one of those countries. He then laid out India's credentials. Since joining the United Nations, India has served 8 times as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, more than many other countries. It has contributed over 300,000 troops and personnel to nearly 50 UN peacekeeping missions, making it one of the largest contributors in UN history. Even today, around 4,300 Indian peacekeepers continue to serve in 10 of the 11 active UN peacekeeping operations around the world. Alongside that record, India is now the world's largest democracy, the 5th largest economy, and one of the most influential voices representing the concerns of developing countries. The Shanti campaign also outlined the priorities India wanted to bring to the Security Council. The first was strengthening the voice of the Global South, arguing that developing countries deserve greater influence in institutions still largely shaped by the geopolitical realities of 1945. The second was reforming multilateral institutions, especially the Security Council itself, so that they better reflect today's world. India also called for modernizing UN peacekeeping missions, addressing the growing risks posed by artificial intelligence, protecting global maritime routes, and intensifying efforts against terrorism and terror financing. Together, these priorities painted a picture of how India believes global governance should evolve in the coming decades. India will contest the Asia-Pacific seat against Tajikistan in the elections scheduled for June 2027, where it will need the support of a 2/3 majority of the UN General Assembly. India enters the race with considerable diplomatic advantages. It has decades of experience on the Security Council, one of the world's largest diplomatic networks, growing economic influence and public backing from several countries, including the United States. That last point perhaps best captures the complexity of India's foreign policy today. Even while Washington and New Delhi were locked in disagreements over tariffs and trade, the United States continued to support India's candidature for the UN Security Council. The two developments were not contradictory. They reflected the reality of a mature strategic relationship. India and the United States can disagree sharply on trade while continuing to cooperate on broader geopolitical objectives. That ability to compete in one area while partnering in another has become one of the defining characteristics of the India-US relationship in the 21st century. The 2028-29 non-permanent seat is important. It is not the goal. India's real objective in the United Nations system is permanent membership in an expanded Security Council. A reform that would add new permanent members to reflect the contemporary distribution of global power rather than the 1945 settlement that gave the veto to the 5 victors of World War II. India's case for permanent membership is among the strongest available. It is the world's most populous country, the 5th largest economy, on track to be 3rd by 2030, the largest contributor to UN peacekeeping operations in history, a democracy of 1.4 billion people, a country with nuclear weapons, a space program, and the world's fastest-growing major economy, a country that the United States, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and, to varying degrees, China have all individually stated they support for permanent membership in a reform council. The obstacle is the reform process itself. Amending the UN Charter to add new permanent members requires the approval of 2/3 of the General Assembly and the ratification of 2/3 of UN member states, including all 5 current permanent members. China has been the most resistant to any reform that would add India as a permanent member. China's preferred approach to the UNSC reform debate is to either block it entirely or channel it toward a framework that does not specifically advantage India. The G4 group, India, Japan, Brazil, and Germany, has been the primary advocate for genuine UNSC expansion, and their combined diplomatic push has built substantial momentum in the General Assembly, even if the Charter Amendment remains elusive. Jaishankar, in his written reply to the Rajya Sabha in November 2024, stated that the government accords the highest priority to getting permanent membership in an expanded Security Council. That language, highest priority, is stronger than anything previous Indian foreign ministers have said publicly on the question. It represents a shift from patient advocacy to active campaign. The 2028 to 29 non-permanent seat is a step in this direction. It puts India back in the Council's working rooms for 2 years, gives India a platform for the voice of the Global South positioning that underpins the permanent membership case, and demonstrates to the 193 General Assembly members that India is a competent, constructive, and active Council member whose permanent presence would strengthen the body. India has served 8 terms. 8 times, India has won the two-thirds majority needed for non-permanent membership. No country that wins that majority consistently over decades, while simultaneously being supported by 4 of the 5 permanent members for permanent membership, remains a non-permanent member indefinitely. The trajectory is clear. The timing is a matter of political will and diplomatic execution. Here's why India's position is unrivaled. The fundamental reason why Trump's tariff pressure on India did not achieve its objectives, did not stop Russian oil purchases, did not force India to choose a side in the U.S.-Russia confrontation, did not accelerate the bilateral trade agreement on American terms, is that India's strategic position has become too valuable to too many parties for any single party's pressure to be decisive. India sits at the intersection of every major strategic competition of the 21st century. The U.S.-China technology competition. India is the alternative manufacturing hub that the United States is investing in as a replacement for Chinese dependence. American technology companies, Apple, Foxconn, the entire consumer electronics supply chain, are shifting production to India. American semiconductor companies are partnering with Indian counterparts. The American government is investing in India's defense technology industrial base. All of this investment creates American interest in India's economic stability and political alignment that competes directly with the tariff pressure. The U.S.-Russia energy confrontation. India is the world's 3rd largest oil consumer and the most important non-Western market for Russian crude. India's purchasing decisions affect Russian revenues, global oil prices, and the effectiveness of Western sanctions. But India's purchasing decisions are also insulated from American pressure by the same economic logic that makes them rational. The price differential between Russian discounted crude and market alternatives is large enough that no reasonable tariff rate changes the fundamental calculation. The global governance contest. India is the only country in the world that has genuine warm relationships with the United States, Russia, China, the European Union, the Gulf states, and the Global South simultaneously. No other country occupies this position. When India speaks in the UN Security Council, it can reach across every geopolitical divide. When India hosts the G20, it achieves outcomes that no other host could have assembled. When India offers its digital public infrastructure to developing countries, it fills a governance gap that neither the Western model nor the Chinese model adequately addresses. This position, the indispensable middle, is not something India stumbled into. It is the product of a foreign policy doctrine, maintained with remarkable consistency across decades and multiple governments, that refuses to make the kind of binding alliance commitments that would compromise India's freedom of maneuver. Non-alignment in the Cold War, strategic autonomy in the post-Cold War era, multi-alignment today. The language has changed. The underlying principle has not. India's relationships are determined by India's interests, not by any external power's expectations. The result is that when Trump threatens tariffs, India can respond with a calm that is not performance. It is the calm of a country that knows it has options, that knows the country threatening it also supports its UNSC bid, also needs its pharmaceutical supply, also is investing billions in its manufacturing sector, also needs its cooperation on terrorism, maritime security, and the Indo-Pacific strategic architecture. The leverage runs in multiple directions, and India, having spent decades building that multi-directional leverage, is in a position to absorb unilateral pressure from any single direction without collapsing. The tariff story and the UNSC story, taken together, are 2 expressions of the same underlying reality. India is no longer a country that the world can define on its own terms. India is defining itself. The McKinsey reports, the investment bank analyses, The geopolitical assessments that spent decades describing India as a country of potential rather than performance. These documents are being revised not because the analysis was wrong about the obstacles, but because India has systematically addressed those obstacles in a way the models did not anticipate. The production-linked incentive schemes that are pulling Apple and Samsung and global defense manufacturers into Indian factories, the digital public infrastructure that is now being exported to 30 countries and endorsed by all 20 G20 members as a global development model. The port infrastructure at Vizhinjam that handled 2 million containers in its first 18 months of operation, the semiconductor fab in Dalera producing its first silicon, the private rocket in orbit, the submarine being built to reach the ocean floor. These are not individual achievements. They are the systematic execution of a national strategy. The tariff story confirms the strategy is working precisely because it reveals America's ambivalence about India. If India were simply a compliance problem, a country that needed to be disciplined into following American preferences, the tariff escalation would have continued until India yielded. It did not continue. Because India is also an investment destination, a security partner, a pharmaceutical supplier, a manufacturing alternative to China, and a democratic anchor in the Indo-Pacific. The complexity of India's relationship with America is the proof of India's strategic importance. Countries that are truly peripheral do not generate this level of ambivalence in the world's most powerful nation. And the UNSC story confirms what the tariff story implies. India is not waiting for the current international order to validate its position. India is actively building the coalitions, the track record, and the institutional presence that will make its eventual permanent seat in a reformed Security Council the logical outcome of a campaign conducted on India's own terms, rather than granted as a favor by existing permanent members. Jaishankar stood in New York and announced Shanti, peace, on India's terms, through India's vision, backed by India's record. The same week, Trump announced 10% tariffs and India called them unjustified. Puri said cost and availability. The diplomatic teams continued their bilateral talks. The trade flows continued. The investment flows continued. The strategic partnership continued. And somewhere in the intersection of all of this, the tariffs and the UNSC bid and the oil purchases and the diplomatic outreach and the domestic economic transformation, is the answer to the question the world has been asking about India for 3 decades, if this is the decade India arrives. Look at what India is building. Look at how India is responding. Look at who is lining up to support them. The answer is already visible. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who still underestimates what India is becoming. Like, subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.